Good day, colleagues. Welcome. Welcome to Mara. Hi, Chantal. Good to see you again. Marian. Welcome back, Fabio. I see some familiar names. Michael.
Morning.
Welcome.
Sorry, yesterday was a holiday in the US, so again, we missed the session.
No, that's no problem. I'm sure the delegates will catch up via the recording, and it's great for those who can be here. Looking forward to our discussion here this afternoon. And while I see you, Louisa, thanks again for your great inputs the other day. Sharing your Foresight experiment with us. I thought it was a great discussion, a great session. So thank you for that. So colleagues, we are going to have a short learning group session this afternoon or this morning if you're in the US. The purpose of the session is really to pause and to think about how you can apply some of these tools to your own experiment. I should note that we have another experiments clinic coming up in just a few days. And so you might want to start getting ready for the experiments clinic. And so to help you in preparation for the experiments clinic, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the experiments template that we've prepared for you. You'll notice that in the template, which is available on HouseSpace, there are a number of pieces already in there that you'll be very familiar with. The first one on the list there is the scoping circle. I'm not going to revisit that today because you've looked at that a number of times. We've also included in that template the UNGP experiments framing template that will help you to frame your experiment. You saw from Louisa and others a couple of weeks ago how they were using that template to work on their experiment. And then we're really going to focus today on step 3 and 4, which is thinking about the drivers of change and what we call domain mapping as part of preparing your experiment, and then some scenario orientation, looking at how we select methods, particularly scenarios method, but it goes beyond that in terms of how we select those methods. And so let me start by just going through the template very quickly. As I mentioned, the scoping circle forms part of that. I'm not going to dig into the scoping circle in any kind of detail. The framing template is also there available for you to use. What I'd like to do as a starting point today is to come to this diagram. This is a diagram that we haven't yet shared with you. I'm going to pause here for a second and just say, for those who've just joined us, welcome. We're looking at our experiments template briefly, preparing for our experiments clinic. And so if you look at this diagram, what it shows you is really a simple way of looking at the 4-stage process. But instead of looking at it at the 4-stage process at the scaffold level, what the diagram does is it gives you one level of detail below that. So in other words, within scoping, if you have completed your scoping, you'll see there on the bottom left, you've really answered the question, what is the question that your project is focused on? And then inside of ordering, it gives you a bit more detail, looking at the steep categories, looking at the information sources that you might be looking at, how you derive your trends and your drivers on the basis of that, your key uncertainties and your scenarios, all the way through to where we are now in the program, which is really about investigating implications. And so this flow diagram, hopefully, will give you a sense of how this entire process fits together. Now, I'm going to change my slides for a second. You should be seeing them in edit mode. That is intentional because I want to bring in a couple of arrows here just to work with for a few minutes. Now, very often, when individuals are designing a Foresight experiment, they go very quickly from the scoping phase into the analysis, into the trends and the drivers, and they start to do scanning or some kind of other Foresight method. And as we've explained to you, in order to do Foresight well, we really encourage you to spend some time on thinking about what is the question that your Foresight experiment is trying to answer. And in really thinking about that, that allows you to think about where will you find the sources of information to explore that question during your ordering phase. Now, in the context of the program, when we've taught you about that, we've taught you about scanning, and I'll put that word in there very briefly. And we gave you examples of a scanning template. We let you do some examples of scanning. but really we only let you do some scanning based on what you find on the internet, or we let you do some scanning based on your own opinion about what some of the trends are. And so the question is, if you design a foresight experiment and you want to take a slightly more sophisticated approach to your foresight analysis, how do you do that? How do you ensure that that process is rigorous? Now, one of the ways you can do that is by using something like STEEP. And I remember Peter teaching you about the STEEP categories: social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. But there are other ways of designing your project at that early stage to ensure that you have a systematic foresight project. The way we do that is by creating what we might call a domain map. Now, colleagues of ours around the world, particularly Andy Hines, who is a foresight expert in Houston, and his forerunner at the University of Houston Clear Lake, Peter Bishop, they like to use this term domain map to talk about how you can organize your foresight project in a systematic way. I use a slightly different term, which is what I'm going to share with you now, which is, and I'll put it inside that arrow there, I like to refer to it as a scanning framework. But really what the scanning framework is a systematic diagram that will guide the foresight process. In other words, when you start to look at trends and drivers of change, and you start to look at key events, you're doing that in a systematic way, rather than doing that in a sort of ad hoc, sporadic way. And so how do we develop a scanning framework? What I'd like to do is to show you an example of a scanning framework, and then talk to you about the process we followed in developing this scanning framework. So this is an example of a scanning framework. I'm going to, for a second, delete the scanning framework and give you a blank page, because in your foresight experiment, you might want to develop your own scanning framework that's completely unique, that's completely specific to your experiment, right? So what could a scanning framework look like? Now, if you look at this one, interestingly, in the previous slide, we mentioned STEEP, and I'm going to grab the STEEP diagram that Johan provided us with here, and I'm going to bring it onto this scanning framework and talk a little bit about this. So what you'll notice is for this project, we wanted to think about the future of city governance, or what you might call urban governance. So what would the future of governance look like in cities? And to do that, we thought we have to be systematic and we have to be comprehensive in how we think about the future of cities. So what we did is we started off by using STEEP, which is the well-known sort of STEEP categories. And we expanded the social one a little bit to look at the socio-cultural. We then identified, obviously, the political, you'll see at top left. And we then identified the economic. Let me grab the blue E for economics. And so what you see there is almost like an upside down triangle where the three ends of the scanning framework sit. So there's some elements of cities or city governance that is social. There's some elements of city governance that is political. And there's some elements of city governance that is economic. And so we started off with sort of an upside down triangle to think about those things. We then said that when you're thinking about the future of cities, one of the major factors of that is obviously going to be government, because city governance is largely determined by what the particular government that's involved wants to do in that city. What are the city's bylaws? What are the laws and regulations that apply to the cities? And so what we did is we superimposed on that triangle of political, economic, and social, we superimposed three levels of government: national government, provincial government, which is there in the middle, and then local government, which is there at the bottom. So now what you've got is you've got the makings of a framework which has politics, economics, and society or social, but it also has the three levels of government: national government, provincial government, and local government. And then we asked ourselves, now we'll come back to the environmental and the technology in a little while, We then said to ourselves, right, we've got the public sector represented. What about the private sector? Because of course, the private sector also plays a very important role within cities. You can't think about the future of city governance without having the private sector. So we created a second little triangle here where we spoke about business formations, supply chains, big business, which is multinational corporations, SMMEs, entrepreneurship. And of course, all of those business elements feature at the national level, at the provincial level, and at the local level within the context of cities. And so you might add a number of these little blue arrows to indicate there's the private sector represented. And we then said, now that we've got this triangle with this national, provincial, and local level and the private sector, what are the issues that you would need to look at if you were going to analyze the future of city governance? So using that framework, now I'm going to delete these colorful pieces of the puzzle that I've added because they were just there to signify how we built the framework. So let me get rid of those and then talk about how we then went about populating the framework. We then said, if you had that framework in place and you were going to do a foresight scan for the future of urban governance, where might you look? And so let me put a little, let's make it a little red dot. Where might you look? Well, we said that obviously from a political point of view, party politics would be important. Labor politics would be important. Other institutions would be important. When we looked at the economic side, we said that trade would be important. Ratings, the credit ratings of a city, of a country would be important. When you look at national government, the rule of law would be important. The rights of the city inhabitants and their constitutional rights vis-a-vis cities, things like water provision, security would be important. If you go subnational, tax revenue and the jurisdiction of cities would be important. If you go down another level, at a provincial level, it gets very interesting because the political process is important. Power and coalitions of political parties is important. Policy and planning. And so you start to see that we infiltrated the model with all kinds of bits and pieces that you would need to look at, things like ecology and climate, finances, spatial design, energy, transport, livelihoods of citizens, all the way down to the very practical local level. Can you have a city without water, without clean air, without debt management, without land use and land access? So these are the kinds of things that a city planner would think about. And so we were borrowing from city planning at the local level. Instead of thinking about it from a planning point of view, we started thinking about it from a foresight point of view. And then you can go all the way down to social and cultural. We said, what about the demographics of a city? What about migration in a city? What about the heritage and the narratives and the myths? So if you think about like a city like Paris, the romantic city, right? What's the role of that myth in shaping the future of that city versus Silicon Valley, which is a technology city? And we went to the health system, etc., all the way down to cultural complexity and identity and so on. Now, once we created the scanning framework, what that meant is we were in a position, and this takes me back to the previous slide, instead of doing foresight, which was our question was, what is the future of urban governance? What's the future of city governance? Instead of just thinking about it simplistically through STEEP, we could think about it at a very sophisticated level using a domain map. And so my colleagues in Houston could refer to this as a domain map. If you were going to think about the future of urban governance, this is what the domain looks like. There's a political aspect, an economic aspect, a social aspect, and then there's all these different elements that go into that form part of the, and let me put that word back on the board, that form part of the domain of urban governance. Now, why are we showing you this as we prepare for the experiments clinic that we are going to be doing in a few days' time? Is what we are saying is we are inviting you to develop a domain map, or as I like to call it, a scanning framework for your own experiment. In other words, if you're going to do foresight on child mortality, what are the political, economic, social aspects of that? What are the legal, regulatory? And by creating that domain map, when you then go into your process of scanning for trends and drivers of change or looking for key uncertainties, you have a much more sophisticated picture of that. Now, I could share with you various examples of these kinds of domain maps or scanning frameworks. The important thing is not to see our domain map. The important thing is whether you have a domain map that is useful and sensible to you in terms of what it is that you are trying to scan. Now, another way of doing that, I've shown you a graphic way using a particular kind of thinking. Another way of doing that is to use some guiding questions. And here I'm going to invite my colleague Johan to talk to us about how you might flesh out these questions using some of these guiding questions. Go ahead, Johan.
Great. Thank you, Marius. Hello, everybody. So this is a little bit a higher level up and really just a guidance or a summary of the things you might be thinking about, or you could be thinking about for your experiment. So it's really just more a checklist rather than a template. And talking through the process on the top left, just a reminder for ourselves to keep, to think about the time horizon. Do we look 5 years ahead, 10 years, 20, or 50, depending on the type of experiment and focus of our experiment? What's the geographical scope? Is it local? Is it regional? Is it global? Like Sandor's the future of asymmetrical warfare on the ecology, the effect of that, etc., which is a global perspective versus the example we had from Cambodia. And also maybe worthwhile thinking about experiment boundaries. Sometimes there are sort of untouchable things in the organization or concepts or ideas or ways of doing, which hopefully there'll be nothing, but it often happens that some aspects are out of boundaries or out of bounds. So maybe it's useful to think also about what aspects will not be considered. For instance, if you're doing something about the, and this is one of my projects when I studied about the future search for extraterrestrial life, what will not be included is UFO and the whole UFO mythology, because it'll have a scientific focus, for instance. So there's some qualifications to set the boundary of your experiment and to basically decide what's in and what's out. And then a next step would be the scanning question. And you remember we talked about drivers of change, weak signals, trends, etc. So just to prioritize most of them and the most important ones of them, and that's what you can do on the left-hand side, for instance, or however you want to organize this based on your scanning. And then also the systems question, and what we like to do at SWOF is to move from the drivers and not just jump directly into scenarios, but do a little bit of a systems thinking about how do these drivers interrelate with one another. What are the emerging themes when we put them together? What are the dynamics in between them, and you know, themes or things we see when we put them together and study their interaction. So there's something about understanding the system a little bit and what emerges from that, which helps us think and construct the scenarios as well. And then maybe just a good question, what are the main uncertainties? Because often we use uncertainties to construct the scenarios, because that is really where the choices lie. Some of the trends are evident and most likely they will continue, but what are the uncertainties that can help us shape the alternative worlds, really? So that's just sort of some guiding questions to help you think about this. And then on the next slide, thank you, Marius, is just an axis, a matrix where you can think a little bit about your approach, and also the type of evidence you would want to be using in your approach. If it's a community-led, highly participative experiment, then that will look much different than, you know, having a lot of interviews with experts, getting quantified data, and then actually make a systems map or a model with verifiable data and tested, having it tested, etc., and then getting extrapolations or, you know, exploring the outcomes around that. And so that's two different approaches, really. So what we ask of you is to think a little bit about your experiment and then think about not just the scenarios, because the scenario methodology links also with, the way you gather evidence, the other sequence of tools or methods you really map into your design. So think a little bit about your broader design. And if you're going to do scenarios, your scenario approach, the axis we have here is something that's structured on the y-axis, structured versus value-based. Structured meaning it's it's very technical in a sense, or structured approach versus values, it's more loosely, if you want to put it that way. And then technical on the left hand side, which also maybe links a little bit with quantifiable data, using high in data. If your project is high, experiment is high in data, versus on the right hand side, maybe something that's a bit more intuitive, more community based, more participative, more conversation and imaginative, versus the technical side, which directs you in more explicit ways. I hope that makes sense. Marius, if you're there, can you just add a little bit on the difference in this graph between structures and values?
So, Johan, thank you for that. What I want to suggest is I'm going to take a few steps back and pretend that I'm using an experiment on the template and then work my way to where you've just been as we move to the conclusion in a few minutes' time. So colleagues, if I go right back to the template, and I took a very generic Foresight topic and I said, one that I mentioned in the chat, what's the future of artificial intelligence in healthcare? There would be all kinds of questions about the risks of artificial intelligence in healthcare, the ethics of artificial intelligence in healthcare, the potential for breakthroughs that AI could, I know, for instance, they're using AI to diagnose breast cancer, using genetic data, big data, where the AI will put you in a risk category to say you're highly at risk of breast cancer and so on and so forth. So the benefits and threats. And so let's imagine for 5 minutes that we're doing a project on AI in healthcare. The scoping note by now you know very well. The question would be, who is this project for? And I might say the project is for the European Union Commission on Health, in collaboration with the World Health Organization. They're doing this project. They're interested in health policy for the UN and health policy for the EU that cuts across from AI policy, data policy, technology policy, to health policy, hospital policies, doctor policies, and also for the private sector, research of AI within healthcare. So we would do a scoping note thinking about the future of AI in the healthcare system. We would then complete the framing template and say, what is the challenge we're faced with? And maybe we formulate that saying that health is a basic human right. Access to healthcare is a basic human right, but technology is pushing the boundary of what's possible. And there are some challenges around technology access in the healthcare space. And so we would complete the framing template to explain our Foresight project. In that bottom middle one, our hypothesis might be that by bringing the European health community, the health stakeholders together in a Foresight project on the future of AI in health, we're going to empower the United Nations as well as the European Union to regulate and create good outcomes for AI in health. That might be our theory of change. Now, when we then come to how we would design our Foresight project, we might say that we've now done our scoping note. We've clarified the question, and the question might be, what are the risks and opportunities for artificial intelligence in health? We then move into the ordering phase, and we start saying, what kind of information sources will we use? Is it health research? Is it doctors at universities, researching medical practitioners? Is it practitioners on the front line in the health, the World Health Organization, where they're thinking about using big data to anticipate the health trends of underprivileged populations? Like, what kind of information sources? How do we design for that? Now, in order to design for that, we might then say, let's develop a scanning framework or map out the health domain. And the health domain might have the politics of health, the economics of health, the social component of health. You might then have, what about global healthcare, pandemics, national health systems, sub-national communities, things like lifestyle diseases. You might develop your own scanning framework. And once you've developed your scanning framework or your domain map, because of course the domain map just describes the domain. It's like looking at Google Maps. You're looking at the Google Maps of healthcare. Once you've done that, you will then go into your ordering process of trends, drivers, events, ideas, what is shaping that. And then you get to the question that Johan is posing, which is, or in fact, before we get to that, you might use these guiding questions to say, right, if we're going to work on health, what's the time horizon? Let's make it a 5-year or 10-year. Let's say artificial intelligence by 2030 is going to proliferate in the health system. So let's make it a 2030 time horizon at a European Union level, for instance, if that was the client. You set the boundaries, so it's a regional boundary, and work your way through what are the key drivers: technology, innovation, investment, private healthcare, big data availability, etc. What are some of the systems dynamics? You might do some causal analysis. And this brings us then to the question Johan was asking, which is, what kind of project is this? Is this a highly structured project, which is very technical? In other words, this is about health policymakers from the OECD or those kinds of institutions that want to use technical data in a very structured project to deliver foresight? Or is this about reimagining health? So when you come down to the level of values, there might be some individuals in 20 years' time who want to spend all their time in artificial reality, where health for them is being in a world of AI, where the meaning of health is going to change. And so is this project about values? And is it an intuitive project about myths and metaphors and worldviews? Or perhaps the project brings together a combination of these things, because it's dealing with AI, but it's also dealing with health and societal perceptions. Maybe the project needs a combination of technical structured work as well as intuitive values-based work. Maybe it needs some technical work on the values of health, which is sort of the public health values piece. Or maybe it needs a very structured piece of work that is aimed at the intuitive aspect, which is maybe we need a longitudinal study by a university on the changing perceptions of health among different generations. And so you would map out what kind of project are we trying to do? And on the basis of that, what kind of methods would best be suited to the project? Now, we've given you a bit of a tour de force of the template. What we're asking you to do before the clinic is to go and practice your muscles, your foresight design muscles, by using the template on your experiment ahead of the experiment's clinic. To remind you, this week, Thursday, we have our webinar coming up with change leaders, and we've got 2 guests coming to talk to us, Dr. Tara and Kolelwa. Looking forward to have them in the room with us. And so, colleague, with that, we're about to come to the end of our quick check-in this week. Let me go back to Johan. Any closing remarks from you, Johan? Any final thoughts?
No, Maurice, I'm just adding a comment in the chat, but that's it. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Johan. And then, colleagues, let me say that the Q&A is open in house space. If you have questions ahead of the Foresight, the experiments clinic coming up next week or ahead of Thursday, please pop them in the Q&A. We'd love to support you and answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Delphine. I see the link is in the chat to the Q&A. Great seeing you all again, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Have a lovely week. See you then.